All right, Aaron Schatz is here. The FTN Football Almanac is one of the meatiest things we get. And let me tell you something. Like these guides, if Phil Steele does this for college, it's the first sign football is here. It's the first sign. Like my favorite thing in the world, different era, used to be going to Barnes and Noble first or second week of July and just spending like $95 on all of the guides. You don't have to do that anymore, but it's still unofficial kickoff to football season. What's going on, man?
Hey, not much. The book is so much work. It's so nice to get it out there. Now I just do a bunch of promotion.
There you
It's
go.
actually a little bit more chill. It's a little more chill than the last couple of weeks have been. But I'm ready. I'm ready for training camp. I've had enough off season. I'm ready for football now.
All right, we'll start here. So you are one of the godfathers of using certain analytics based tendencies in football evaluation. There's a lot of now that analytics is everywhere. It's like as they say, victory has many fathers, or defeat is an orphan. There are a lot of people who have contributed to this inside the NFL and outside the NFL, but you are absolutely on the Mount Rushmore of that. I'm curious where you think that has shown up the most in football, where you see things and you go, oh my gosh, like this is really what we were talking about 15 years ago. It's now shown up in football.
I mean, what's interesting is that I think that where analytics has shown up a lot, we don't know, right?
I
Because
completely agree.
so much of the value of analytics over the last 4 or 5 years comes from things that have been discovered in the data from the next gen stats, the player pads of the trackers, and we don't know
Mhm.
we only know what the big data bowl has found from that stuff and what Amazon
Right.
Prime can do with that stuff. We don't know yet what teams have discovered because they're not going to tell anybody.
Right.
As far as things that are actually viewable, I think the three things are: first, the fact that teams are much more aggressive on fourth down since the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl.
I completely agree with that.
Two, what's happened to running back contracts. And I'm sorry, I apologize for that.
Yes.
But that's clearly an example of analytics having done its due diligence to raise the contract values at other positions like offensive line and lower them at running back.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is in the stuff from the big data bowl that's used on broadcasts now, especially
Mm-hmm.
that Prime Vision broadcast from Amazon Prime. You see things like rushing yards over expected and punt return yards over expected and things that are based on next gen stats that certainly you would have never seen on a broadcast 6 or 7 years ago.
I think analytics departments, in large part, are kind of black boxes of franchises, and the things you hear about, like the real deal special research stuff, it's all like third hand, fourth hand. Nobody wants to say anything what they're actually doing and how they quantify. And I really do think, and I think we've both joked about this in the past. If Bill Belichick was honest about the way he approached team building, analytics would have been embraced by football in 2006. But
Yes.
he intentionally said, "Oh, I don't know what I don't know what they're doing at the Northeastern Analytics Conference." Buddy, you accepted an award from Sloan. You know what Sloan is. You know what Snapchat is. He was intentionally presenting himself as a Luddite to not let anybody know he was basically at his face value was just doing basic economic principles, but he had Ernie Adams doing all of this research. He understood everything. He understood the cap well before anybody else. He was doing analytics a long time ago. He just didn't talk about it. And
A
you hear
good
stories. Go ahead.
a good example in the modern world is the Los Angeles Rams have attributed their success with lower round draft picks in part to their analytics department.
Mm-hmm.
I have absolutely no idea what kind of actual analytics they've
Right.
done to help them pick those players, but they do attribute some of that success to the analytics. But we don't know what they've done because no one will talk about it.
My hope is that when it stops being an edge, they tell us. Like for that's just not a Rams thing. That's just to everybody. I just want to know what that is. And so, like, I'll give you a great example. When tracking data came into the league 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there was a team that told me that they were using the tracking data and matching up with their scouting reports. And they're saying, hey, did we think this guy was fast or whatever? And they basically redid their draft informally. They're just messing around. They redid their draft once they had the tracking data and said, hey, this 6th round pick should have been a 2nd round pick. We just didn't know how fast to move with pads on. And they didn't know that until November when they see all of the data where they see some random cornerback, who's faster than some 1st round pick. And they didn't know that. And so now you go on the front end and you say, okay, well, if we know that, can we get the college tracking data? Now, it sounds like I'm not actually sure where they are officially on that, but it sounds like a lot of colleges will share that information. So you get that information, and then you can say going forward, hey, we're
It's not
never
very standardized
right,
across the conference. The
right.
way the NFL is, everybody does the same thing for all 32 teams. College teams are all over the
Right.
place.
So if you do your due diligence on the analytics side of it, you never have to draft a cornerback who plays slow ever again. You never have to get baited into this guy ran a 4.2 at the combine. He must be fast. No, you don't have that because he played in the SEC or he played in the Big Ten. And guess what? He ran at 22 miles per hour all of the time. And you don't have to go off of 1 week in Indy. That's why for me, the combine, especially with the speed part of it, has become overrated. I still believe in the explosion numbers with jumping and all that stuff, but you're going to have get off time in college. You're going to have, just actual speed in college. You're going to have, they have the gauntlet drill where it's Puka Nacua was really good at it last year. Keon Coleman was good at it this year, where you're running with the ball in your hands. Well, guess what? We have a lot of data on what it looks like when you actually run with the ball in your hands, but it's against LSU and not against random people in Indianapolis. So it'll be interesting. Before we get into the guide, do you have like I love asking this question to GMs or people who are at least analytical minded. Do you have a holy grail still to come of information you either wish was public that might be proprietary now, or just something you think we might be able to measure soon that would really open up new avenues of sort of evaluation?
I mean, the holy grail is what if the NFL gave out the next gen stats data
Yeah,
during the season instead of holding it for 2 years and then giving you like half a season's worth of something
yeah.
in the big data bowl, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if we could get 2024 live? It's actually a little bit of a problem. They didn't realize that they had a little bit of a gap in their code, and we could freely get some of the next gen stats on a play by play basis, like what were the personnel on every play. And they discovered the hole in the code near the end of last year, and all of a sudden that went away. And so a lot of stuff that was being done publicly based on that had to go away too, which is kind of a bummer. Now at
Mm-hmm.
FTN, we have a charting project that duplicates a lot of that stuff, but it doesn't duplicate it live based on chips in the pads. You have to go and chart it so you don't get the data till a day or two later. And the same goes for all the other companies that do charting. Whereas if we got that stuff straight out live from the chips in the pads, people could do amazing amounts of research and tools that you would have online to show how teams are performing in different ways in different situations and different coverages and personnel groupings and so on.
It'll be fascinating to see the arms race going forward and what the NFL allows. I have a funny interaction from years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, where someone had said to me, one downside of all of this player tracking is teams might use it against players in renegotiating their contract and say, hey, you used to run this go route at 21 miles per hour. Now it's 19. We're going to have your salary next year. Take it or leave it. By the way, everybody else has this data, right? So I asked someone who negotiates contracts and I was like, hey, are you guys going to do this? And they were like, what? And I was like, are you guys going to do this? And they're like, no, we don't get specific now on like why people have to take a pay cut. We're just like, hey, this is your new salary, take it or leave it. He's like, we don't need ammo for that. The NFL teams are already more ruthless than we think, and so like they don't actually need any more reason to be like ruthless, like just vicious, salary slashers.
And if they made that data all public, player agents could go to the teams and go, look at what my guy did, and he should get a raise, or this is why we should get an extension, or so on.
Well, that's what like Scott Boras in baseball, like this whole thing is like unbelievable research and like
Yeah.
convincing you that this guy is an icon who must be that's all salary arbitration hearings have been for the past 30 years. Anyway, I don't know what goes on in baseball anymore. Why should you bet with Caesars Sportsbook? 2 words: Caesars Rewards. Every bet brings you closer to the types of benefits only Caesars can offer: hotel stays, VIP experiences, sports and concert tickets, and more. It's not just an app, it's an empire. The Chiefs are not, and listen, I am on your side as far as probability and all this stuff, and a lot of times people just don't understand what that looks like. The Chiefs are not the Super Bowl favorite in the rankings. The Niners have the best metrics overall. I'm curious what goes into that and how you view the Chiefs. Are they met? And I know sounds like a crazy idea. Let's start here. What goes into the Chiefs not being the favorites?
I think that part of it is the general belief that playoff games are not worth more than regular season games, right?
Mm.
Like when you're judging the Chiefs, you want to judge them on the regular season and the playoffs. And the same goes for the Baltimore Ravens and whoever else. But playoff games aren't worth more. They also, their playoff games were not resounding victories. Like they outplayed teams that they were playing against, but they were mostly close. So, you know, you look and you believe in what they do, and I think I have them third in my projections.
Mm-hmm.
I think
You
they're
do.
third in wins and third in Super Bowl probability. So it's not like I'm discounting them. But I mean, San Francisco and Baltimore were so far ahead of the rest of the league in my numbers during the regular season last year that you kind of, even after you account for all the players that have left Baltimore, you end up with those two as the top two projected teams for this year.
Interesting. Um, is there something about the Chiefs that defies the numbers? Does it show up in the numbers? Like, I mean, it just seems to me like so much of what they do, Aaron, defies even football logic. I mean, they didn't have receivers last year. I mean, for large parts of the last few years, it's just been option routes to Travis Kelsey, and that's it. And the drop rate was the highest in the NFL. Is are Mahomes and Reed miracle workers, or do they get? And this is a terrible thing to say. Like they get a little bit of luck, and then obviously capitalize on it because they're so good at late game execution. Like, explain what the data says about their run these last few years.
Yeah, it's a combination. I mean, listen, you have to acknowledge the fact that they play better in the playoffs. They just
Yes.
have played better in the playoffs. They just have. And when you play better in the playoffs, you do things like win 3 Super Bowls.
Yes.
Um, I don't know whether that's a statement that like quarterback becomes even more important in the playoffs than it does otherwise. Because I mean, you have anecdotal reasons to believe the opposite, like the 2000 Ravens, but those are rare. Um, I think everybody feels Mahomes had an off year during the regular season, but I don't think anybody ceased to believe that he was the best quarterback in the game over the long term. That if you
Yes.
said who is the best player in the game, the answer was Patrick Mahomes. So of course, when you got to the playoffs and he sort of ceased to be having an off season and went back to being Mahomes, it wasn't like a shock in any way. It was like this is how we know that this guy can play if he gets a little bit of agreement from his receivers. I mean, I think Spagnuolo was an interesting discussion because the Kansas
Mm-hmm.
City defense was not a top 5 defense during the regular season and never has been, but they have also played better in the playoffs. And Spagnuolo's defenses in general, going back to the Giants, have played better in the playoffs. And so, like, where does that come from? Is that a smarter ability to game plan in those specific situations where you have the 1 week to concentrate on the one opponent and the schedule is a little bit different? I don't know the answer to that question.
You say in here that you think Chicago and Indianapolis are expecting too much from their young quarterbacks. I think they're two slightly different situations. I think the Colts with Anthony Richardson, I think that there was a proof of concept last year that Shane Steichen is a really good play caller, maybe more so than what I would expect in Chicago. And I think the Colts would be pretty good this year. The Bears are probably a year away. What do you think about those two teams? Why did you single them out for kind of relying on young quarterbacks too much?
Just because I think that that's where the excitement comes. And yes, the fact is, when you have a rookie quarterback, and Richardson is sort of in effect a rookie, I mean, we've
Yes.
only seen a
Yeah.
couple
A
games of
rookie and a
him.
half. Yeah, I get you.
You have to expect that they will be bad, no matter how high they're drafted. There's a possibility they'll be good. There's a possibility they'll be really bad. But you have to expect that they'll be bad and then that they'll get better in future years, right? Like it's those guys, that's usually the way that the path goes. And so you can't expect, even when they have a lot around them, like um, the way Williams, they've put a lot around him in Chicago. I also think those defenses like are not as good as the fans think they are. Indianapolis, by our numbers, was not as good as their record last year. Their defense does not look particularly strong. Chicago's defense really improved in the second half of the year, but it was heavily based on takeaways. Takeaways tend to regress from year to year more than preventing yardage does.
Mm.
And so we see the Chicago defense as playing worse. It's also so much of their defense last year was based on Jalen Johnson being awesome, which he was. The problem is that cornerbacks are very inconsistent from year to year. It's really a conundrum because you know the cornerback position is important, but you also know that it's very unpredictable. So it's hard to know quite what to do with those guys when they're stars.
I think with the Colts, like I think Richardson's floor is so high. Like I've seen it. Then there's an athleticism there. Most athletic guy basically in the history of the combine at the quarterback position. Steichen's a good play caller. I'm expecting way more of them than Chicago. I asked you, actually, these are two separate questions, but I'll start here. Who's gonna be the worst team in football this year?
The Giants, I think, are pretty clearly what you would think of as the worst team in football. And that's because the other teams at the bottom of our projections have hope, right? Chicago, what if
Sure,
Caleb Williams is good?
sure,
Washington, what if Jaden Daniels is good?
yeah,
Arizona, what if Kyler Murray goes back to the Kyler Murray of 2.5 years ago? With the Giants, I don't think there's any hope.
yeah,
Like, what if Daniel Jones is good? What evidence is there that that's possible? Like, it's not like he's not going to be horrible because
yeah.
he's not horrible, but he's not really good either. And their defense doesn't look like it'll be great. And it just, yeah, I think that that's the worst team in the league.
I think there's hope for things other than wins, if that makes sense. I think there's hope for development of certain players. That could be Malik Neighbors. And the numbers on wide receivers with the Giants and Soto Beckham left are grisly, man. They are grim. They're not safe for work. Like Neighbors will shatter
Neighbors was
the last
number
5 years
one in
of
our
numbers.
playmaker score projections. The fact that Neighbors was able to do so much at LSU while
Mm-hmm.
sharing the ball with Brian Thomas is meaningful.
Right. Yes. So then you have Kayvon Thibodeau's development on the other side of the ball. You have individual players where I think there's gonna be some building blocks there that we're gonna see in the next couple of years. But I agree with you. Daniel Jones is bad. Um, there's too many just straight up holes in the roster. So I think that they're going to be really bad. You singled out they're obviously not going to be the worst team. In fact, they're probably going to compete for a playoff spot. You hate. Maybe I'll leave it up to you if you actually hate this. You don't like Atlanta's defense. Explain.
Yes, Atlanta is our worst projected defense.
Okay.
They're just, in general, not good, and things don't project for them to be good. Um, I think that they had a little. I'm trying to remember exactly where the projections came from. They lost some talent.
Mm-hmm.
Calais Campbell, for example.
Sure.
I mean, Clark
Down
Phillips,
in
I think,
Miami
is a
now.
talented guy, and we know AJ Terrell is a talented guy. But if you look at like their roster, like you just don't. It just there isn't a lot of defense there that you're like, that's the defense. All right, let's rock and roll. It doesn't. I mean, when you talk about Atlanta, you talk about the skill players. You don't really talk about the defense. I mean, yeah, I mean, Grady Jarrett is good, but the pass rushers, for example, it's like Lorenzo Carter and
Mm-hmm.
Ebikide, and like I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure, but um, there's really nobody that promising.
The Kirk Cousins thing to me, I would have loved to have seen Dallas Turner there. And the Kirk Cousins thing for me made so little sense because when you sign Kirk Cousins, you're all in on winning 11 to 12 games or 10 to 12 games. And you should do everything you can to win 10 to 12 games. That's the mission. You've established the mission, credibility at the quarterback position. And then immediately, like it's a win now move. And then the first major decision you have after signing Kirk Cousins, you make the move for 2027. And I'm not, it made no sense to me. There was no coherence in that plan. You go out and you get Dallas Turner now, or you get any of those pass rushers, and you say this is where you trade down. And I understand like they were worried that Penix was going to go to the Raiders. Fine, let him go to the Raiders. Pick a cornerback pick Terry Arnold later in the draft, and get some draft capital from it. Pick one of the pass rushers in the mid teens. Like there were so many other options you could have done on defense, and they didn't do
I'm
it.
fully with you. The problem from an analytics perspective, the problem is not drafting Penix. It's drafting Penix after signing Cousins. If they
Yes,
had not signed Cousins and then they had taken Penix eighth, we all would have been like, well, that's higher than we expected him to go. But I mean, it makes sense to take quarterbacks high and they need a quarterback, and that makes a lot of sense. It's the combination of the two that no one felt made any sense. Yes.
completely agree. And I got crap from Falcons fans a couple weeks ago because I made a joke, and I really do. Criticism of the pick is not criticism of Michael Penix. They're two completely
Right.
separate things. And I said on NFL Live a couple weeks ago, and I got so much stick for it. I said, the Falcons had no credibility at the quarterback position, and then they now have too much. And like it's true, they have too much credibility at the quarterback position. Like, sorry, like, and I'm only half joking. Like, you only need one. Like, and it's different with Jordan Love and Aaron Rodgers because Kirk Cousins has no equity built up in Atlanta. As most people have said who've been in NFL locker rooms, like Kirk Cousins probably has never met most of his teammates at this. I mean, at the point of the draft, he has now because of mini camps and all that stuff. But like, he didn't know anybody. How many days did he spent in Flowery Branch, Georgia, and all of a sudden he's got a rookie at his heels? Like, it just made no sense from any perspective.
There's value in that highly drafted rookie backup, right? You never know when your starter is going to go south. Look at Jalen Hurts, right? In retrospect, that was a great pick, but I don't know if that's a great pick at number 8,
Right.
given the other things your team needs, and given that the thing about those first round quarterbacks is that you get the 5 years, and how many years of Penix are you actually going to get under the cheap contract and really be starting him? And that's where the complication comes in. I think the idea of, if they had backed up Cousins with a quarterback taken high in the second round, like a Jalen
Mhm.
Hurts level, like I think that would have been a really good move. But
Yep.
number 8 is really high to do that.
I I'm right there with you. All right. Who's a player we should be talking more about in the NFL?
I mean, I just said that cornerbacks are inconsistent from year to year, so I don't know if he's going to be as good this year. But I thought about this, and my answer was Jalen Johnson.
Mm.
I think when people talk about the best corners in the league, they rightfully talk about like Sauce Gardner and they talk about
Hmm.
Patrick Surtain a lot. And I don't think they talk about Jalen Johnson as much as they should, but he was
Hmm.
really, really good last year.
I completely agree. We mentioned the Bears earlier in this. Is there like when you are saying they're relying too much on a rookie quarterback? Do you think the Bears generally are a good team that could compete for a playoff spot?
I mean, it's tough because, I think that the rest of the defense has problems. Like there's one pass rusher. And I don't know how much if Kevin Byard is the Kevin Byard of 2 years ago. And
Hmm.
Tyreek Stevenson, I don't know how good he really is at the other cornerback spot and stuff.
Hmm.
There's no question they've the receivers are is a good gang. Now, here's an interesting thing from our projections. All other things being equal, this is counterintuitive. But teams that draft a receiver really high in the first couple rounds tend to take a step back, all other things being
Mm.
equal, and then a step forward in the second year of that guy. I know that that's counterintuitive, and you can find examples like the Bengals, like when they drafted Jamar Chase, that their offense suddenly exploded. But you look at all the highly drafted receivers of the last 10 to 12 years, and you end up with this sort of general idea that it's the receivers really help the whole offense take a step forward in year 2 rather than in year 1, which I think is interesting.
Last sort of quick hitter before we get into some deeper discussions about the sport. Team that we should be talking about more.
Um, Not as a Super Bowl contender, but if you like over-unders, season over-unders, and you want a team that's underrated, New Orleans.
Mm,
because New Orleans is, what is the first adjective that comes to your mind when I say the New Orleans Saints?
expensive.
Expensive, yeah, and old, but
Old.
also an adjective that comes to most people's minds is average,
Yes.
but
Well, or like
mediocre.
mediocre, or I don't know how to describe it. Like there's a high floor because they want to establish a credibility. They're almost like the Chicago Bulls, where they're always trying to be the last playoff team.
Yeah, except they're doing that with the number 31 projected schedule as what
Right.
I think is the best team in a bad division. Like, I feel like the Saints are like the 15th or 16th best team in the league, but with an easy schedule in that division, that could be 10 wins.
Yeah. That's it. It's a good thought. I mean, like Atlanta to me, and then we're writing off the Bucks for some reason. I'm not really sure. I think that people are forgetting that the Bucks play in the division they won last year. Like
Yeah,
we're always like, even like on TV the other day, they were, "Wow," and then the Bucks. I'm like, wait, the Bucks are. There's a reason they won the division last year. It's because basically it was by default, and the division did not get significantly better. I think Kirk Cousins adds an element there, but you talked about the defense being the sort of Achilles heel. The Penix thing might get a little weird. The Panthers I
they
are kind of
wrecked
bad
their
at this.
defense. Like, for everything they tried to do to help Bryce Young this offseason, they wrecked their defense.
Yes. Anyway, we're underrating the Bucks now. Liam Cohen, the offensive coordinator now, used to be in the Los Angeles. If that hire goes well, it's the biggest thing in the division this year because I
Unless
think
the
they can.
Clint Kubiak hire goes well, in which case
Correct.
that might be the biggest thing in the division. Both of
Yes.
those teams hired someone from that family tree,
Yeah.
tree.
Quick. You have a bunch of research at the front, which makes me of the guidebook that I thought was really good. I want to start with this, and this kind of surprised me. A team will score more when playing a bad defense, and will give up more points when playing a good offense. But like, can you just kind of take me through some of the numbers here about just like how big the disparity is?
Yeah, I don't have numbers on the tip of my tongue, but there's no question. The whole point of that is just that you have to account for schedule strength,
Yes.
and people don't. Now, listen, in the preseason, it can be hard. First of all, accounting for schedule strength based on last season's records is a bad idea because teams have changed. Like, the Jets are not a bad team anymore, so you don't want to pretend that playing the Jets
Right.
is like playing a bad team. But like, I'll tell you, like in our projections, Buffalo has the hardest schedule
Right.
and New Orleans is 31st. And therefore, even though Buffalo comes out as a much better team, New Orleans actually comes out slightly higher in average wins. Schedule does matter.
Yes, and we don't. I mean, like, I think the fantasy guys look at that from week to week because they're obviously just going. They're projecting different defenses, but like, I don't think I do. I don't think I do. Like the example you used, which is Dak Prescott played an easier schedule than Josh Allen last year. I never think about. I never think about it. And that's what I'm saying. Like that got me thinking a little bit in the research. Like the Atlanta Falcons, we love what Brian Callahan and Zach Taylor did with Jake Browning last year, but the Atlanta Falcons had more yards per play than the Cincinnati Bengals last year because the Cincinnati Bengals had a really hard schedule and the Falcons had a really easy schedule. So going through it like that, I thought that was really good. I've heard this a million times, and I love to dig into it. That offense is more consistent than defense
Yes.
and it's easier to project. And I've known this for as long as I've been reading analytics stuff for football. And I'm curious, has that changed within that truism? Has anything changed in the modern era? Is it getting more true because of how dominant offenses are? Like what is that, and what's happening to
I
that?
keep meaning to write about this. In the last few years, it's actually been less true.
Uh oh.
But my guess is that that's just a blip of history. My guess is that
Right.
it's still, if you look over the long term, like if I was to say over the next 5 years, which do I think will be more consistent and predictable? The likelihood is offense.
Mm-hmm.
A big reason why is the importance of the quarterback position. I mean, Brian Burke from ESPN Stats and Info
Mm-hmm.
once said to me, it's almost like the NFL is a cross between a team sport and an individual sport because
Right.
the quarterback position is so important to the offense. And that creates that consistency because that position is so important. And then the other is I think some of it has to do with the fact of injuries on defense, because defense as a whole is a weak link system where you attack the weakest link of your opponent. So if you have 10 good defenders and one bad one, that's almost worse than having like 6 good defenders and 5 average ones, because like that bad guy is going to get attacked by the offense all the time. And so if injuries cause you to have those holes on your defense, I think things are going to swing around a lot.
Okay, so last part of this is that championship teams are defined by their ability to dominate inferior opponents, not their ability to win close games. The Chiefs had a point differential last year of 77. Now, typically that has been significantly higher. The year before was 127. In 2019, in Mahomes' second year a starter, was 143. In his first year a starter, it was 144. So it was about halved last year. And we saw that. I mean, we saw them lose some really, really grim games, even into December. And I've always said, we talked about this, playing your best in the playoffs. That I believe that's a skill. Like I believe that's, I'm a big golf fan. I believe when guys win majors, it's because they're supernaturally good at playing their best when they're supposed to play their best. And I always go back to the Bill Walsh thing, which is there's no such thing as clutch. There's only everybody else starts to act differently and you execute exactly normally over and over and over again. There's no such thing as rising to the occasion. No such thing. Because if you're rising to the occasion, it suggests that your normal baseline is not playing as well as you could. So, no, there's no rising to the occasion, just executing normally. The Chiefs have that ability. I'm curious, you mentioned the championship team thing. Like, is that true in playoff football, or is playoff football
Yes.
just a different beast?
The team that in the regular season had like the larger point differential usually wins in the playoffs more than the team with the lower point differential does. It just, I mean, it's just a history is filled with teams that had close wins over opponents, like close wins over bad opponents during the regular season, and then got to the playoffs and didn't win. I mean, a really great example is the 2022 Minnesota Vikings,
Mm-hmm.
who were filled with these close, lucky wins over not so great opponents, and then got to the playoffs and lost to the Giants, who, by the way, also had a bunch of close wins over not so great opponents. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact is, going into the playoffs, I think the Baltimore Ravens were rightly favored in the AFC because they had dominated during the regular season, and not only dominated, but dominated good opponents like San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco and Miami, like really good opponents. And it's just, just because the team is favored, random chance, sometimes they don't do it. And if you're right, and the Kansas City does have that ability to keep the even keel better in the playoffs, that's a reason, certainly, why Kansas City took it all. But in general, yes, it's better to dominate bad teams. It's a better signal. There's more signal in dominating bad teams than there is in close wins.
When you do all of this, and maybe this is an impossible question to answer, when you do all of this, what is the number one thing you uncovered in your research where you're just like, holy crap, this surprises me?
Well, the fact is, I'm following my numbers during the
Sure.
season and I'm following personnel changes in the off season. So it's rare that I do something that I go, oh, wow, that really surprised me, because I'm sort of in the know about these things.
Mm-hmm.
I will say there is a piece of research in this year's book that Scott Spratt did for the Atlanta chapter asking
Okay.
about drafting Michael Penix. And he looked at how much better are teams at drafting players in the right order compared to if they drafted players in random order
Okay.
at different positions,
Yeah.
right? Like, do you get a player who's actually better than the next player drafted at that position, right?
Mm-hmm.
How much can Atlanta feel like by taking Penix as the fourth quarterback, they got the fourth quarterback? Believe it or not, quarterback is one of the best positions for teams to draft compared to what randomness would be like.
Hmm.
Defensive tackle came out number one, and quarterback came out number two. Even though we all talk about all the time, like, oh, wow, like it's so hard to draft quarterbacks, they bust so much. The fact is, you can feel better that you're drafting a better quarterback than the rest of them that are still on the board.
Mhm.
than you can about almost any other position.
So you're saying that quarterback 4 is a better bet than cornerback 4?
Yeah, it's better. It's a better bet that quarterback 4 is in fact the fourth best
Yes.
quarterback than that
Interesting.
cornerback 4 is in fact the fourth best cornerback. Yes.
It's more efficient and rational. That is interesting. That's interesting. I mean, like, the quarterback market is so funny to me because it's like the old saying, like, it's not about, the biggest danger is basically what your strongest held beliefs being wrong, and that's what undoes everything in your life, right? Is like the number one, your core tenet being wrong is what leads to collapse of yourself, right? And I think a lot of times with the quarterback hierarchy going into drafts, I think our biggest mistakes sometimes are like, oh, of course Trevor Lawrence is generational. Like, of course, that's a given. That's always like, and then they don't even get like, there's not even a debate about it. There's not, you can't even discuss it in March. You can't even discuss it in February. And so, what's funny to me about, I'm like Joe Burrow injecting himself into the Tua Justin Herbert discussion with his final year of college there was rare. Normally, now I think the sort of quarterback hierarchy gets decided like the year before, and it's all interesting. I have a lot of
If
takes
anything,
on it.
guys fall out. They don't
Yes,
come up. They have
yes,
bad senior years and they fall out. Like there was a
yes,
point where people were talking about Spencer Rattler as a top
right,
pick, right?
right.
Guys fall out more than they come up.
And then a lot of these guys just have to hold serve, right? Or like Jaden Daniels came up this year. That's a different
Yeah.
thing. But like Caleb Williams really had to hold serve for him to be the number one overall pick.
We
He
need
did
to
not
get
have to
rid of
do a
the
lot.
word generational.
I
That's what I
completely
think
agree with
because you
that.
can't have Caleb Williams, Trevor Lawrence, and Andrew Luck cannot all be generational prospects. They're in the same generation.
Aaron Schatz, tell me where we can get the book.
All right, ftnfantasy.com/almanac if you want to get the online version. And if you are a subscriber to FTN's data and projections and all the good stuff we have, you do get a discount on it. If you want the big print version, you can go to Amazon and search for FTN Football Almanac 2024. It's got Travis Kelce on the cover this year.
Love it. Aaron Schatz, thanks so much, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me on.